I remember in November 2019 reading an Israeli newspaper which I subscribed to called Arutz. And the title of the article was Inclusive Victimhood versus Competitive Victimhood. I'd never met the person who had written the article. Her name was Professor Nurit Shanabel. But I lecture at Tel Aviv University, and Joyce and I were due to be in Israel and Palestine in January 2020, just before the chaos of COVID. And so I reached out to a colleague in Tel Aviv University, Nimrod Rossler, who's a colleague, and he introduced me to Nurit, and we met in a coffee house in Tel Aviv to discuss her thinking and her work around inclusive versus competitive victimhood. And over that coffee, I said to Nurit, I think I'd get a small grant of about $25,000 to $30,000 to explore this concept in the British-Irish context and the Israeli-Palestinian context. And then you know what happened, COVID. So we conducted literally this year's project virtually, which was incredibly difficult. I twinned Parent Circle, that are an Israeli-Palestinian group of people who have lost loved ones in that conflict, with those in the British-Irish side using two victims group in our Northern Irish context. It was difficult. Stories of Hamas suicide bombers, stories of children who had died where a rubber bullet hit a kid in the back of the head from the Israeli border police. Stories in my own theatre in the Northern Irish context that I know only too well. One story of a man called Seamus, where two gunmen broke into his home in the 70s, shot his father dead, then lifted him out of his mother's arms and put him into the lap of his 6-year-old sister and shot his mother dead. Stories like Alan McBride, whom you saw there a few moments ago, who lost his wife and his father-in-law in an IRA bombing in October 1993. So you've got to ask the question, do these theological concepts like forgiveness, grace, reconciliation spill into the chaos of life outside Trinity United Methodist Church in Gainesville? Or is this something that we just stroke each other with on a Sunday, makes us feel semi-good? Or does the gospel have reality in that chaotic world in which we live? I'm ordained now 36 years, and I've wrestled with those questions literally all my life. And then I hear the words that Steve read to us, where Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, exercise forgiveness, etc., etc., etc. And we do need to realize that the words that Steve read to us were not written in Disneyland, where you can feel good for one day. Let me contextualize where Jesus was speaking these words. He was speaking these words while the Jewish nation was under the jackboot of the most efficient military machine on planet Earth, namely the Roman Empire. So if you talk about superpowers today, be it China, be it Russia, be it the United States, the Roman Empire was the superpower of the day, the most effective, efficient military machine on planet Earth. And yet Jesus comes out, let's be honest, with this literally outrageous statement. Love your neighbor, you know that one. But I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. But me being me, I ask the question, who do you mean? Who is my enemy, Jesus? And as I look at his context, I think there's probably a number of people Jesus could have been speaking about. The Pharisees, the people of Jesus' day who were the interpreters of those ancient texts and allegedly never got any of their interpretations wrong. You know the type of theology that I mean. It exists in the United States as much as it exists in my context and many other contexts. The people Jesus clashed with continually during his time on planet Earth. On the other hand, perhaps he was referring to the Roman occupiers. You're asking me as a person, Jesus, to forgive the people who are persecuting us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And of course, you may or may not remember the encounter that Jesus has with the Roman centurion. Which, to be honest, even as a follower of Jesus, it annoys me no end. You are saying that the person with the most faith in all of Israel is a Roman centurion who is occupying our nation? Come on. But that's what he said. I have not seen so great faith in all of Israel. So you're saying, Jesus, the Roman centurion's faith is better than the 12 disciples, many who wrote the Gospels? Yes. Are you saying his faith is better than the teachers of the law, the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees? Yes. I don't get it, but I didn't say it. The Son of God said it. If you struggle with that, have a conversation with Jesus. Not with Steve or Catherine or Joyce or I as theologians. Wrestle with that. It's a very, very difficult text. And maybe, Jesus, you're referring to the tax collectors. The tax collectors were the collaborators of the day. Turncoats, we may want to call them, who jumped into bed with the Roman machine so they could tax their own fellow countrymen and women even more heavily. Who were you talking about, Jesus? The Pharisees, the Romans, the collaborators? Or maybe you were rebuking people in Israel who were in political power. So who are those whom Jesus wants us to love? And I know if I did a straw poll today, you would say, oh, Gary, the homeless, the downtrodden, those who are poor and beg in street corners. We need to love those people. And in many ways, let's be honest, at times they're relatively easy to love, because loving them makes us feel just like Jesus. But the outcasts were not the enemy. Those in power over us, particularly when they abuse power for their own interests, let's be honest, they're pretty easy to hate, but they're not easy to love. A few months ago, I had a delegation of both Republicans and Democrats who spent a week with me in Belfast. I do some consultancy work with the Carter Centre in Atlanta, facilitating, I guess, what we call in our Northern Irish context, uncomfortable or difficult conversations. The Carter Centre at the moment has a project called Faith Forward Democracy, asking Republicans of faith and Democrats of faith, what does your faith mean in a very contested, divided United States? And I remember a couple of years ago reading an article. I'm putting my glasses on because the print is pretty minuscule and I don't want to get my text wrong. And I was in an American magazine, US magazine called News and Reporting, February 2020. So I want to take you from Gainesville to where Joyce and I will fly to on Tuesday morning to Washington, D.C. The title of the argument, or the article, was this: Loving Enemies is Hard at a Post-Impeachment Prayer Breakfast. The writer says, inside the International Ballroom at the Washington Hilton, the mood at the National Prayer Breakfast was half church service and half political rally. The program began with a song all of you in this building know, a very spirited rendition of Hank Williams' I Saw the Light. Maybe, Marissa, you'll sing it later. I am not. Okay. And it was led by members of the House of Representatives Prayer Breakfast Group, followed by prayers by a Republican, John Mulliner from Michigan, and a representative, Tom Souza, a Democrat from New York City. Their prayers, their opening remarks, echoed the larger theme of that prayer breakfast in D.C., centering on Jesus' commandment, love your enemies. The event's keynote speaker was the brilliant Harvard University professor Arthur Brooks. And he urged those in disagreement over politics not to let them lead to us being contemptible towards one another. And Brooks interestingly recalled speaking to a group of conservative activists and telling them their political opponents were neither evil nor stupid. That line, he said, did not get much applause. But he went on to tell a story. In other words, to humanize himself. He said, I was raised by Christian parents in Seattle. They had progressive politics. He says, my mom and dad were neither evil nor were they stupid. And he challenged listeners to remember their loved ones who had different points of view and to stand up for those who would ridicule them. But Brooks also said, Jesus asked his followers to love their enemies, not just tolerate them. But putting that into practice is pretty difficult. And then he asked the question, how many of you in this crowd in the Washington Hilton Hotel today have loved someone with whom you disagree politically? He said a number of people in the audience did raise their hands. And the Democrat representative from New York City said, if we're going to heal our divisions, we need to spend time together. There was one person who should have been at that prayer breakfast. All of you in the room know this person. But they couldn't be because they were struggling with cancer. John Lewis, a name you know very, very well. He gave the benediction, the final prayer, by video, live link, and he asked the attendees, I want you to join hands and bow your heads. He said, this country needs peace now more than ever, and Lewis asked God to bring the country together and pray that Americans would see each other as brothers and sisters. But in his prayer, Lewis recalled facing death when he was beaten while crossing the Edmund Peters Bridge in Selma, Alabama on a civil rights march. He said this, I never hated the people who beat me because I chose the way of peace, I chose the way of love, I chose the way of non-violence. And he said, I never gave up because God helped me. And he urged those attendees to become one family. He said, we must believe in one another. We must never give up on our fellow human beings. The Bible is littered with texts in relation to this. Genesis 50. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. If you rejoiced at the ruin of a person who hated me or exalted them when evil overtook them, from the book of Job, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Some of us were not born in 1983. Some of us were maybe too young to remember this story. But on Christmas Day 1983, let me tell you of an event that took place in Rome in Italy, where Pope Paul John II went into the Rabiba prison to visit the Turkish-born terrorist Mahat al-Agala, who had attempted to assassinate him 2 years earlier. You may or may not remember the footage from that scene. It was a very bare prison cell. And those two men talked, their heads incredibly close together, and the world's media was there to capture the scene, but not the words. And the television cameras that recorded that wordless event made a very amazing, indelible impression in a world saturated with bigotry, hatred, terrorism, and bloodshed. And when the Pope eventually emerged from that meeting, Naturally, those reporters surrounded him in their usual media scrum and said, "What did you say? What happened in that room?" He said this: "What we talked about will remain a secret between him and me, but I spoke to him as a brother whom I pardoned." What we talked about will remain a secret between him and me, but I spoke to him as a brother whom I pardoned. 2 weeks later, Time magazine, not the Florida Methodist Newsletter or the Baptist Times or the Presbyterian Herald, but secular Time magazine picked up the story. I remember that stage. I subscribed to Time magazine. I remember the copy coming through my letterbox and looking at the front cover, which was all primarily black with a red question mark and a question of 2 words: why forgive? And Lance Morrow, who was not a theologian, he was senior editor of Time magazine, wrote these words. I'll read them to you. He said, "Christ preached forgiveness. The loving of one's enemies is at the center of the New Testament." And he said, stated nakedly, superficially, the proposition sounds perverse, even self-destructive, an invitation to disaster. Forgiveness is not an impulse that is in much favor. He says it's a mysterious, sublime idea in so many ways. The prevalent style in the world is more akin to the mentality of the high plains drifter, to the hard, cold eye of the avenger, to a numb remorselessness. But he finished that article with one sentence, which has always stuck with me. And he said this: "Forgiveness may not look like a tool for survival in a bad world, but that is exactly what it is." Forgiveness may not look like a tool for survival in a bad world, but that is exactly what it is. So these things we sing about, we talk about, we worship about, are they really worth anything in the public square? I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. But I look at the US at the moment with despair. Politics will always be politics, because politics is temporal. The gospel's eternal. And yet I look at many people of faith and they are more interested in the temporal rather than in the eternal. When I die, trust me, I don't want to die of a heart attack because I'll not be able to say goodbye. I suppose the ideal death maybe is that you're told you have 1 year to live, you're in your 90s, you do some of the things you want to do, and when you die, your family are gathered around you and you say your temporal farewells, which they are for people of faith. I will not be thinking about Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, Boris Johnson, Vladimir Putin on my deathbed. But yet the energy that the church is consumed, as we were too. So I'm not talking to knock Americans. I spent my life knocking people in my own space who were more in love with politics and temporal symbols than they were with Jesus Christ. So for you as people of faith, I say it's a time to redefine what is important. I'm not asking you not to be a Republican or not to be a Democrat. That's a personal choice. But as one writer said quite categorically, politics has a strong grip on our hearts. The gospel's grip should be stronger. And that's why these concepts are difficult. They're not easy. But Jesus said, to be a follower of him in a painful, chaotic, turbulent world, principles like forgiveness, love, grace, kindness are going to last. Temporal things will not. Think on these things. Amen.